The frost had got into the church overnight, and Eleanor Price could see her own breath by the light of the single candle she had carried in from the vestry. She stood in the cold nave with the black-edged letter open in her gloved hand, reading it for the third time, and still the words would not rearrange themselves into any sense she could keep. A man named Jonas Fenwick, a clockmaker in a village 40 miles to the north, a stranger she had never in her 26 years so much as heard named, had died 3 months since and left her everything he owned. The house, the clock, certain effects. She read the phrase certain effects again, as though it were a sum she had added wrongly, and then she folded the letter carefully along its old worn creases and set it on the ledge of the pew beside the poor box, and she went on counting the coins she had been counting when the carrier's boy had brought it to the door. She did not weep. There was no one to see her if she had, and weeping had never once in her life made a column come right. But that was not the reason. The reason was simply that she was made so, her father had said of her, kindly, when she was a girl of 10, that Eleanor took the world the way a good ledger took ink, one clean line at a time, and let nothing blot. She counted the poor box now to its end, 2 shillings and 4pence halfpenny, 3 farthings, a Portugal piece some sailor had dropped in that would not spend, and a button. She wrote the sum in the little book in her own hand, the right forefinger of her glove worn thin over the ink stain that lived on the finger beneath it, the stain of 20 years of her father's parish accounts kept faithfully in this cold room. Then she closed the book. The church was St. Michael's in the Devon village where she had been born, and it was not hers any longer, nor was the vicarage, nor the living. Her father had been a month in the ground under the yew by the south wall, and the bishop had given the parish to a Mr. Hollick, a sound young man with a wife, and a way of looking at Eleanor as though her continued presence in the house were a small untidiness he was too polite to mention. Her trunk stood half-packed in a room that was no longer her room. She had, when the letter came, been counting other people's charity, because there was nothing else left in the building that was hers to do. She took the candle and the letter and went out through the low door into the churchyard, and the cold took her by the throat. The frost lay white and thick on the grass and had furred the iron of the lyke gate so that it glittered, and the smell of cold stone gave way to the smell of the moor, which was the smell of nothing at all, of clean air and old rain and the year going down toward its shortest day. She stood a moment under the lyke gate, where every coffin in the parish had rested on its way in, her father's among them, and she made herself think plainly. She had, in the world, 31 pounds and some odd shillings, the wreck of her father's small savings after the doctor and the undertaker were paid. She had a trunk of gowns twice turned, and a workbox and her father's Bible and his sermon books, which no one would buy. She had an aunt in Taunton who would take her as a companion, unpaid, and use her hard, and speak of it forever after as a Christian kindness. That was the whole of what Eleanor Price possessed on this frozen morning, that, and a letter that made no sense. She read the covering note once more, standing there, holding it near the candle, though the day was coming gray over the moor, and she scarcely needed it. It was written in a close, elderly, careful hand, and signed Josiah Treadwell, solicitor of Barnstaple. "Madam," it began, "it falls to me to acquaint you with a matter that will, I do not doubt, surprise you as much as it has occupied me. My late client, Mr. Jonas Fenwick, clockmaker and warden of the Almshouse called Fenwick's Rest in the parish of Combe Marrow in this county, departed this life on the 14th of September last, and by his will, which I hold and which is in every particular good and proper, he has devised and bequeathed unto you, Miss Eleanor Price, daughter of the Reverend Thomas Price of St. Michael's, the whole of his real and personal estate, that is to say, the dwelling house known as Fenwick's Rest, the turret clock thereto belonging, and certain effects, moneys, books, and instruments as are set forth in the schedule. I am aware, madam, that you were not acquainted with my client, and that this news must come to you strangely. I can only assure you that his intention was clear, settled, and often repeated to me in the last months of his life, and that it was his most particular wish that you should come north to take possession in your own person. And his words, madam, which I set down as he gave them, that you should wind the clock. I shall attend you at Fenwick's Rest at whatever day you may name. Wind the clock. Eleanor turned the note over, but there was nothing on the back, and she had already read the will's schedule twice. It was a dry list, a house, a workshop, tools of brass and steel, ledgers, 100 and some pounds in the Barnstaple Bank, 4 beds, a quantity of coal. It told her what he had owned. It did not begin to tell her why a dead stranger should give it to her. But there was a second paper, and it was this one she had read 3 times, and it was this one that would not lie quiet in her mind. It was folded small, and had been enclosed within Treadwell's letter, and it was written in another hand entirely, a hand that had once, she thought, been fine and even, and was now shaken almost past reading, the letters trailing where the pen had dragged. A dying man's hand. There was no date and no direction. There were 2 lines only. You will not know me, it said, but I knew your mother's name, and that is enough. Win the clock. That was all. No signature, but it could be no one else. Eleanor stood under the light gate with the frost stinging her cheeks and read the 2 lines a 4th time, and for once the clean single line of her mind would not hold. Her mother. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 7, of a fever that took her in a fortnight, and Eleanor's memory of her was a warmth and a low voice and a smell of lavender and very little else. A slight woman with auburn hair, from somewhere in the north of the county, her father had said, married young and quietly and much loved. Her mother's name. What had a clockmaker in Combe Marrow to do with her mother's name? What was there in it that could be enough? Enough for what? Enough to give a stranger a house. Eleanor had kept her father's accounts and her father's house, and, in the last long year, her father's dying, and she had a mind that did not like a sum it could not see the working of. Here was a sum with no working at all. There was only a shaken hand, and a name she had not spoken aloud in 19 years, and the same odd instruction twice, wind the clock. She could not answer it standing in a churchyard, and the cold was in her bones now. She folded both papers together and put them inside her glove against her wrist, where she had carried important things since she was a girl, and she walked back up the frozen lane to the vicarage that was not hers, and she made her decision on the way. In the plain manner she made all her decisions, by asking what else there was to do. There was Taunton and the aunt. There was, now, a house 40 miles north that was, by law and by a dead man's clear and settled wish, entirely her own. A person with 31 pounds and a half-packed trunk did not turn her back on a house, and there was, though she did not put it first, being an honest woman even with herself, she did not put it first, but she did not put it last, there was the wanting to know. She had a great deal of her father's steadiness and a little of something that was only her own, and the something wanted to stand in front of that clock and find out what a stranger had meant. She told Mr. Hollick's wife that she was called north on a matter of business, which was true, and told nothing, and the wife's relief was so plain and so poorly hidden that Eleanor was almost sorry for her. She finished the packing of her trunk. She wrote to Mr. Treadwell that she would come, and named the day and gave the letter to the carrier. She went to the churchyard once more, in the last of the light, and stood by the raw earth under the yew where the grass had not yet come. And she did not speak, because her father would not have cared for speeches. But she stood a while, keeping him the only company she had left to keep. And then she went in out of the cold. A farmer named Coombe, whose accounts she had set straight more than once, and who owed her father a kindness or two, said he was carrying wool to Barnstaple within the week, and she was welcome to the seat beside him and the shelter of the cart tilt. And so it was in a wool cart. On a morning so cold the ruts rang like iron under the wheels, that Eleanor Price left the village she had been born in. She sat with her trunk behind her and her father's Bible on her knee and her hands, in their thin gloves, folded on the book, and she watched the country she knew give way to country she did not. It was 2 days' road. The first day took them up off the low green land she knew, up and up by lanes sunk deep between banks where the last brown fern hung stiff with frost, and out at last onto the high moor. And there the world opened all at once so wide that Eleanor caught her breath. She had not known there was so much sky. The moor ran away on every side in long swells of dun and gold, the dead bracken gone the color of a fox in the low sun, and the granite breaking through the grass in gray backs and shoulders, like the bones of something vast lying under the hill. There were no trees to speak of, only here and there a thorn bent all one way by the wind, and the wind came steady and cold and smelling of peat. And now and again a moor pony lifted its shaggy head to watch the cart go by, and somewhere a curlew cried its long falling cry, which is the loneliest sound God made. And yet, Eleanor thought, not a sad one, only very old, and very far, and not caring whether it was heard. She wrapped her cloak the tighter, and she was not sorry she had come. There was a largeness in the cold country that answered something in her. Farmer Coombe was a silent man, which suited her, and they put up the first night at a poor inn on the moor's edge where the fire smoked and the sheets were damp, and Eleanor lay awake a long while, listening to the windwork at the shutters and thinking, against all her habit, not of columns and sums, but of a warmth and a low voice and a smell of lavender, 19 years gone. In the morning the frost was harder still, and they went on, dropping now off the high moor by long slow miles into a country of narrow combes and small grey villages, and at last, in the failing afternoon of the second day, into the parish of Combe Marrow. The carrier set her down where the lane came into the village, for he must go on to Barnstaple with his wool before dark, and he handed down her trunk and touched his hat and wished her well with an awkward kindness. And then the cart went creaking away, and the sound of it faded, and Eleanor Price stood alone in a strange village in the last light, with everything she owned in the world at her feet. Combe Marrow was a small place folded into the side of a wooded combe, a scatter of low grey cottages along a single street, a squat church tower, a public house with a swinging sign she could not read at this distance, smoke standing up straight from a few chimneys into the still, freezing air. A dog barked somewhere and left off. A woman drawing water at a pump looked at her and looked away. And at the far end of the street, a little apart where the ground rose toward the wood, stood a long, low building of gray stone that Eleanor knew, the instant her eye fell on it, for the place she had come to. It could be nothing else. It was longer than any house in the village and lower, a single story drawn out under a heavy roof of stone slate green with moss, with 4 squat chimneys ranged along its ridge, and a row of small, deep-set windows, and over the middle of it, breaking the line of the roof, a squat square turret of the same gray stone, and set into the face of the turret, catching the very last of the failing light so that it showed pale against the dark stone, was the round white face of a clock. Eleanor left her trunk where it stood. There was no one in that village who would trouble it, she judged, and she was right, and she walked up the street toward it in the cold, her breath going before her heels loud on the frozen ruts. The light was going fast now, the west a low band of hard gold behind the black wood, and as she came up under the wall of the place she could read the name cut into a stone lintel above the heavy door, the letters worn but plain, Fenwick's Rest. And below it, smaller, a line she stopped to read, for the poor women of this parish. So, it was more than a house. She stored that, as she stored everything, in a clean line, and looked up. The turret stood black against the dying gold, and the round face of the clock looked down at her, and Eleanor Price stood in the frozen lane and looked back at it, and a small cold thing went through her that was not the wind. For the clock was stopped. The two hands stood out clear and dark against the pale dial, and they did not move, and she watched them a long moment in the great stillness of that place to be sure, and they did not move. They stood where some hand had left them, or where the works had failed, or where she did not yet know what. They stood, both of them, fixed and dark and certain, at 7 minutes past 4. Somewhere behind that gray wall 4 old women were keeping what warmth they could against the falling night, though Eleanor did not yet know it. Somewhere within, a wall of clocks stood silent that had once all kept true time, though she did not yet know that either. She knew only what stood before her, a stranger's house that was now her own. A name on a lintel, a dying man's 2 lines folded warm against her wrist, and above her in the last of the light a clock stopped dead, waiting at 7 minutes past 4. Wind the clock he had written twice in a shaken hand, as though it were the one thing in the world that still needed doing. Eleanor set her hand to the cold iron of the door, and drew a slow breath of the freezing air, and knocked. Mr. Treadwell was already waiting when the farm cart drew up at the low gray wall, a stooped figure in a black greatcoat too large for him, stamping his feet against the cold and breathing on his fingers. He had a way of holding his half-moon spectacles a little off his nose to peer over them, and when he saw Eleanor step down from the cart with her one trunk, he came forward with both hands out, as though she were a much-expected guest and not a stranger from 40 miles south. Miss Price, I would have known you anywhere. He caught himself, and a faint color came into his lined cheeks. That is, forgive an old man. You have something of a look, I remember. You have come a long way, and the light nearly gone. Come, there's a fire of sorts within. She thanked him and gave the carter his coin and watched the cart turn back down the lane before she followed the solicitor toward the door, because she had been raised to finish one thing before she began another, and paying a man was a thing finished. The Almshouse rose long and low against the darkening moor, its 4 chimneys leaning slightly, one of them smoking thin and gray. Above the central door the turret sat squat as a broody hen, and in the last of the light she could just make out the clock face. The 2 black hands stopped where they had been stopped when she first saw them from the lane, 7 minutes past 4, holding the hour against all the turning of the sky behind it. Treadwell followed her eyes upward. "Aye," he said quietly, "it has not gone since March. We could none of us bear to try it." He did not explain, and she did not ask. Not yet. She had learned in a month of burying her father that grief liked to be let out in its own order, and other people's grief most of all. The door opened before Treadwell's hand reached the latch, and a woman stood in it with a rushlight lifted, 70 if she was a day, straight as a fire iron for all her years. with a face carved sharp by weather, and a cap gone yellow at the edges but scrubbed and starched to within an inch of its life. She looked at Eleanor the way a farmer looks at a heifer he has not yet decided to buy, from the gray bonnet to the mended hem of the dove-gray gown, and lingered, Eleanor saw it, on the ink-stained forefinger of her right hand where the glove had a small worn hole. "So you're the one he gave it to," the old woman said. It was not a welcome and it was not an accusation. It was only a fact, laid down on the step between them like a coin. "I am Eleanor Price," Eleanor said, low and even. "And you knew Mr. Fenwick, I think, better than I ever did, which is to say not at all." Something moved at the corner of the sharp mouth, not quite a smile. "Widow Hesketh, I've kept this door 40 year, girl, and I'll keep it while I've breath. You'd best come in out of it before the frost takes your ears off." And she stood back, which was, Eleanor understood, as near to a welcome as she would get that night, and worth more for being so grudging. Inside, the Almshouse was one long low room running the length of the building, the ceiling crossed with black beams close enough that Treadwell had to duck his head. A single hearth burned at the center, banked small and careful, and the warmth of it reached only a little way into the cold that lived in the stone. Down each side stood the beds, 4 of them, narrow as coffins and neat as a nun's, each with its own small chest at the foot and a shelf above where a life had been shrunk down to what it could hold, a Bible, a cup, a child's shoe kept for reasons no one now living remembered, a twist of dried lavender, a pair of spectacles with one arm mended in thread. 3 other women sat near the fire, shawled to the chin, and turned their faces toward the door as one, the way the very old do turn, slowly and altogether, like plants finding a window. "The 4 of us," Widow Hesketh said, seeing where Eleanor looked. "There were 6 when I came. Martha in the corner, she's 90 and deaf as the wall. Don't trouble to shout at her, it only vexes her. Then Ruth, then Suki by the fire there. And me. Jonas kept us, fed us, warmed us, physicked us when the winter got into our chests. 40 year I've watched wardens come and go, and not one of them was fit to black his boots." She said it fiercely, and one of the women by the fire, Ruth perhaps, made a small sound of agreement, and reached out a knotted hand toward nothing, toward the memory of him. Eleanor went to the fire and greeted each of them by name, bending to take the hands they offered, and did not flinch at the cold of them or the tremor. She had done this 1,000 times in her father's parish, gone into the cottages of the old and the dying, and sat with them, and her voice fell naturally into the register she used for it, unhurried, close, as though there were all the time in the world and she had come only to see them. It was not a thing she did to be seen doing. But she felt, without looking, that Widow Hesketh watched her do it, and that a small weight shifted somewhere in the old woman's reckoning of her. Treadwell drew her at last toward the far end of the room, where a plank door stood ajar on a smaller chamber, and lifted a candle from the shelf and lit it at the fire and carried it through. "His own quarters," he said. "The warden's room. I've touched nothing. It did not seem I did not like to." The candle showed her a room that was more workshop than lodging. A narrow bed stood pushed against one wall, made up and cold, but the rest of it belonged to the trade, a long bench under the shuttered window, and on it, and above it, and around it, the whole apparatus of a clockmaker's life. Phials ranged small to large on a rack, little pots of oil, their rims darkened, trays of brass wheels, some no bigger than a farthing, their teeth catching the candlelight and throwing it back in small gold sparks, tweezers, gravers, a jeweler's loop on a length of frayed ribbon, a vice bolted to the bench end and clamped in it still, as though the hand that held the file had only just that moment set it down, a half-finished movement, its wheels bright where they had been worked and dull where they had not. And along the wall above the bench, on nails and small brackets, hung the clocks. A dozen of them, more. Faces of painted tin and faces of enamel. Tall case innards taken out and hung bare. A bracket clock with its door open on stopped works. A little carriage clock. A wag on the wall with its pendulum hanging straight and dead. Not one of them moved. Not one of them ticked. The room was full of clocks, and it was utterly, deeply silent. The kind of silence that has a weight to it, that presses on the ears. And Eleanor stood in the middle of it and understood, before Treadwell said a word, that this silence was itself a kind of message. That a man who had spent his life making time go had, at the end, stopped every clock he owned and meant something by it. He was found there, Treadwell said softly, and nodded toward the chair by the bench. In March. Suki brought his supper, and he did not answer, and she went in, and he was sitting just so, quite peaceful, his head bowed over the bench as if he'd nodded off at his work. The doctor said his heart. He was 71. The old man took off his spectacles and polished them on his sleeve, a gesture Eleanor would come to know as the thing he did when his feelings ran ahead of his words. A good man, Miss Price. I had his business 30 years, and I never knew him do a mean thing nor a dishonest one, which is why he stopped and put his spectacles back on and squared himself and became the solicitor again, which is why we had best sit, for there is a deal to tell you, and not all of it easy. They sat at the bench, Eleanor on the clockmaker's own stool, and Treadwell on a chair he drew up, and he opened a leather case he had carried under his arm all this while, and took from it his papers, and laid them out with the care of a man dealing a hand he was not sure of. You know the substance of it from my letter, he began. The house, this house, Fenwick's Rest, the whole of it, walls and beds and workshop and all his effects, the clocks, the tools, whatever monies were in his own name, he has left to you, freely, wholly, without condition. That much is plain and drawn up tight, and no man living can shake it. It is yours, Miss Price, from tonight. He looked at her over the spectacles. But you must understand what the house is, before you understand what it is not. Tell me, Eleanor said. Fenwick's Rest is an almshouse, a charity, a very old one, founded, the tradition goes, near 200 years since, by a family long died out, to house and keep a set number of poor women of this parish for the term of their natural lives. Widow Hesketh and the 3 others are the charity's people. They are not Jonas's tenants, and they were not his servants. They are the almshouse's charge, and the almshouse's duty, and by long custom the warden, the man who keeps the place, sees them fed and warmed and doctored, was Jonas, as his father was before him, and another before that. And now, Eleanor said slowly, following it as she would follow a column of figures down a page, the warden is to be me. If you will have it, there is no other. That is the first thing. Treadwell drew a breath. Here is the second, and here is where the ground grows soft under us. A charity of this sort keeps itself by an endowment, land, given long ago, whose rents come in year on year and pay for the coal and the bread and the physic. Fenwick's Rest has such an endowment. Certain fields, a mill leat, 3 cottages let to farming folk out on the Bratton Road. I have the schedule of them here. Their rents are what keeps the 4 women alive. Jonas gathered those rents as warden and laid them out as warden, and never took a farthing of them to himself, His own living came from his trade, from the clocks. He tapped the schedule with one finger. The endowment is not his to leave you. It was never his. It belongs to the charity, in trust forever. It is a thing quite separate from the house, do you see? The house he owned and has given you. The endowment he only kept, as a steward, keeps another man's purse. Then it goes on as it was, Eleanor said. The rents come in, the women are kept, and I keep them, as he did. So it should, said Treadwell, and now his voice dropped, and he took off the spectacles again, and did not this time put them back. So it should, Miss Price, and so it must, if there is any justice on this earth. But, he set the spectacles on the bench between them, but I cannot find the deed. The deed. The trust deed. The founding instrument, the very paper that says these lands are settled upon the poor women forever, that no man may buy or sell them, that the warden holds them only in trust. Without that paper in my hand, I can prove the charity's title to no one. I have searched 30 years of his papers, Miss Price, the box at my office, and the chest in his own room yonder, and I find rent books and receipts, and his own faithful accounts of every penny, but the deed itself, the trust deed, is not among them. And a charity that cannot show its deed, he spread his old hands, is a charity that a bold enough man may say never existed. He may say the lands are only land. Private land that came to Jonas somehow and passed with the rest of his estate, or worse, that Jonas sold in his lifetime. And rents that were the women's bread become of a sudden some man's private income, and the women become that man's tenants to be turned out at his pleasure. The fire settled in the outer room. One of the old women coughed, a long, thin, rattling cough, and Widow Hesketh's voice murmured something to her, low and rough and gentle. You speak, said Eleanor very evenly, folding her hands on the cold bench, as though there were such a man, as though you had one in mind. Treadwell's mouth thinned. I have had a letter, he said, from Bristol, from a Mr. Silas Fenwick, who signs himself the nephew and nearest blood of the late Jonas Fenwick, and who gives me to understand that he considers the whole of his uncle's estate, the house, the effects, and, he is most particular to name them, the lands, to be his by right of blood, and that he means to come into this county within the fortnight to see his rights established. He looked at her steadily. I never once in 30 years heard Jonas name a nephew. But a man may have kin he does not speak of, and this one writes like a man who has been reading law over another man's shoulder, and smells money and is coming for it. Eleanor sat quite still. She was aware of the silent clocks along the wall, and of the cold coming up through the stone floor into the soles of her boots, and of a small hard clarity settling in her chest that she recognized. It was the same clarity that came to her over the parish accounts, when a sum would not balance, and she knew, before she found it, that somewhere a figure had been set down false or left out on purpose. It was not fear. It was attention. Then the whole of it, she said, the safety of those 4 women, hangs upon a single sheet of paper that cannot be found. Just so. A man who kept accounts as faithfully as you say he kept them, she nodded toward the chest, the rent books, does not lose the most important paper he owns. He puts it where it cannot be lost, where he can find it and no other man will think to look. She turned it over the way she turned a stubborn figure. Mr. Treadwell, where did Jonas Fenwick keep the things he most did not wish to lose? It was not Treadwell who answered. Widow Hesketh had come to the doorway of the little room without either of them hearing her, and stood there now with the rushlight burning low in her hand. her sharp old eyes going from the solicitor to Eleanor and back. And it was plain she had heard the whole of it, and plain, too, that she had known this hour was coming and had waited for it, perhaps for months. "You're quick," she said to Eleanor, and it was not entirely a compliment. There was suspicion in it, as though quickness were a thing to be watched. But she came on into the room and set the rushlight down among the brass wheels and folded her arms over her flat old chest. "I'll tell you where he kept it," she said, "for I stood by him near half my life, and I know his ways as I know my own hand. When Jonas had a paper that mattered, a lease, a receipt for a great sum, aught he'd not trust to a drawer, he'd not put it in the chest, and he'd not send it to Barnstaple neither, begging your pardon, sir." She jerked her chin at Treadwell. "He'd carry it up the little stair behind the hearth, into the turret, and he'd open the great clock, his own clock, that his own hands built when he were a young man, that struck true over this village every hour of every day for 50 year, and he'd put it inside the works, wrapped in oiled paper, snug behind the wheels where no damp came and no thief would ever think to feel. I've seen him do it. He'd come down wiping his hands, and he'd say," and here the old woman's harsh voice cracked, just once, and steadied, he'd say, "There now, Peg, the truth keeps time. Not safe as a thing the clock's minding for us." The little room was very quiet. Above them, through the beams, through the plank ceiling and the stair Eleanor had not yet climbed, the great clock stood in its turret with its hands held fast at 7 minutes past 4. Silent since March. Silent since the morning they had found him bowed over this very bench with his supper going cold beside him. Eleanor looked up. Toward the ceiling, toward the stopped clock she could not see, but could feel now above her like a held breath. She thought of the shaking line in the dead man's own hand, the line she had carried 40 miles folded against the black-edged letter, that she had turned over and over on the moor road without understanding a word of it. "You will not know me, but I knew your mother's name, and that is enough. Wind the clock. Wind the clock." "He stopped them all," she said, half to herself, looking round at the dozen dead faces on the wall, and then up again. Every clock in the house. And that one last of all. She drew the letter from inside her gown. Though she did not need to read it, she knew it now by heart. "He did not tell me to mourn him, or to keep the house, or to mind the women, though I think he trusted I would come to all of that. He told me one thing. He told me to wind the clock." Treadwell had risen. Widow Hesketh had gone quite still, her arms unfolding slowly to her sides. "Then that," said Eleanor Price, folding the letter away and rising from the clockmaker's stool with the candle in her hand, "is where we begin. Not tonight. I'll not go up that turret in the dark and cold and worn from the road, and do a careless thing to a 50-year clock because I was in a hurry. But in the morning, with light and with care." She looked at the old woman, and something passed between them, some first thin thread of trust drawn taut. "In the morning I will climb up and open his clock, and we shall see what it is he left the truth to keep for us." She stayed his hand before he could touch the latch again. Though she did not move at all, it was only that her voice came down the flagged passage cool and even. "You have come a long way for a house you have never seen, misser. Fenwick." He turned from the door with the smile already on him, and Eleanor understood in that first moment what Widow Hesketh had meant when she said he smiled before he lied. He was a well-made man of 40, dark-haired and oiled at the temple, and his coat was a green too fresh and too fine for a country lane in February, a Bristol coat, a town coat, the wool of it gleaming where the Almshouse candles caught it. He had come in without knocking, and he had gone straight to the far door as though the passage and its worn flagstones were already his to walk, and he had laid his gloved hand upon the latch of Jonas Fenwick's workshop, before ever he looked to see who stood in the room. Miss Price. He came toward her with both hands lifting a little, as if he would take hers between them, and she kept her own folded at her waist so that he could not. Forgive me. I had thought the house empty save for the poor old souls. You are, of course, the young woman my uncle named. I had heard of you in Bristol, and I could scarce credit it. A parson's daughter, a stranger, and my own blood passed over. But I bear you no grudge for that. None in the world. He was not himself at the end, you know. Not himself at all. I did not know him, Eleanor said. So I cannot say what he was. No, how could you? He let his hands fall and looked about him, and she watched his eyes go over the low room the way a man's eyes go over goods laid out on a stall. The shared hearth with its small fire, the 4 narrow beds beyond the inner door, the settle, the row of cracked delft on the dresser, the good oak of the settle back. He was pricing it. She saw him price it. A melancholy place, he said pleasantly. You'll not want to be burdened with it, I think. A young woman of your quality. It wants a deal of money it hasn't got, and there's the difficulty. Mr. Treadwell had risen from the bench by the fire where he had been sitting with his half-moon spectacles pushed up into his gray hair, and he came forward now with a stiffness that was not all his years. Mr. Fenwick, you did not tell us you were come into Devon. Treadwell. Silas gave him a nod that was almost fond. Still keeping the old man's papers in order, I see. A faithful servant. I'll not need to trouble you much longer, though I thank you for it. He drew off his gloves finger by finger and laid them on the table, and from the breast of the green coat he took a folded packet of documents tied with a black tape, and he set that down beside the gloves with a small, deliberate care that was worse than any flourish. I've come to spare everyone a great deal of trouble, he said. Myself most of all. I'll own it. I'm a plain man. I don't pretend otherwise. But you, madam, and these poor women, and you, Treadwell, in your duty. There's no call for lawyers and delays and expense that none of us can bear. It's all quite simple, once it's understood. It's only that it hasn't been understood. Then help us to understand it, said Eleanor. He liked that. She saw him like it, that she had not wept, had not wrung her hands, had asked him a plain question as one might ask the price of corn. He drew a chair from the wall without being offered it and sat, and he untied the black tape with unhurried fingers, and he spread the topmost paper flat upon the scrubbed board and turned it about so that it faced her. My uncle, he said, God rest him, was a clever man once. A maker of clocks, but he grew old, and he grew, I'll use no unkind word, he grew confused. The rents of the Almshouse land had long been more than the house could swallow, and he was pressed, and there were debts he was ashamed of, small foolish debts of an old man's pride. And so, 8 months since, in the presence of witnesses and before a Bristol attorney, he sold the endowment lands to me. For a fair sum, to keep him out of the sponging house and to see the thing kept in the family where it belongs. He tapped the paper twice with one clean nail. This is the deed of sale. There is his hand. There are the witnesses. There is Mr. Cundy's seal, an attorney of good standing in Small Street, Bristol, whom Treadwell may write to and welcome. The lands are mine. The rents are mine. I say it without heat. I take no pleasure in it. But the 4 women here are my tenants now, and the house you've been left, Miss Price, is a shell without the rents to warm it. You've been left a burden and a draught. Eleanor did not reach for the paper. She let it lie facing her and read it where it lay, unhurried, the way her father had taught her to read any account set before her, top to bottom, and then again from the bottom up, trusting nothing because it was written fair. Treadwell had come to her shoulder. She heard the small sound he made, breath drawn in through the nose, and when she glanced at him, his kind stooped face had gone the color of tallow. He took his spectacles down from his hair and set them on his nose and bent close over the deed, and his finger hovered above the signature at the foot without touching it. "That is very like his hand," he said at last. "Lo, God forgive me for saying it. That is very like Jonas's hand." "It is his hand," said Silas comfortably. The downstroke of the J, Treadwell murmured, more to himself than to any of them. He made it so, and the little check in the tail of the K, where the nib caught, he stopped himself. He straightened, and he was an old man again and frightened. "I should want to see it beside a paper I know to be true," he said. "I should want to be very careful. Be as careful as you please." Silas leaned back in the chair. "Write to Cundy. Write to the witnesses. They're named. They're plain. Thomas Rudge and Amos Kello, both of Bristol. Both honest men who will swear to what they saw. Take a 12-month over it if the delay pleases you. Only understand that the rents fall due at Lady Day, and it's I who will be collecting them. And it's I who will decide who bides in these beds come the spring." He said it all very gently, smiling. And that was the horror of it, that there was no shout in him, no fist upon the table, only a soft, reasonable voice pricing beds and women as another man might price sacks of meal. He rose, then, and did the thing Eleanor would remember longest. He walked the length of the low room past the inner door, and he stood in the doorway of the sleeping chamber where the 4 almswomen sat drawn back against the wall, Widow Hesketh foremost, upright as a fire-iron, her 3 companions huddled by her like hens under a hawk's shadow, and he looked in at them and counted them under his breath. She heard him. 1, 2, 3, 4, as one counts stock brought in from a field. Then he stepped to the nearest bed, the empty one nearest the door, and he set the toe of his good town boot against the frame of it and pressed, testing whether it would bear a man's weight or whether the joints were sprung, and finding it sound, he made a small satisfied sound in his throat and turned away. Widow Hesketh said nothing, but her old eyes followed him the whole length of his walk back, black and steady, and there was that in them which Eleanor was glad was not turned on herself. Silas went last to the workshop door, the far door his hand had been on when Eleanor first spoke, and this time he opened it and put his head within into the cold dark where Jonas's files and brass wheels and the wall of stopped clocks kept their silence. He did not go in. He only looked, and Eleanor saw his eye run along the shelves and the vise and the ranked tools and the dull gleam of the metal, and she knew he was weighing the brass by the pound and reckoning what the scrap of it would fetch in a Bristol yard. "There's good metal in here," he said, half to himself. He never knew the worth of what he had, the old fool, nor how to keep it. He drew his head out and shut the door and turned to her, easy again, generous again. "But there. I run ahead of myself. We're none of us barbarians, Miss Price." He came back to the table and took up his gloves and did not put them on. "I'll deal fairly with you," he said, "because I see you're a sensible young woman and not a watering pot, and I honor you for it. The house is yours. I'll not contest the house, though I might. Live in it, sell it, do as you like. But it's a poor gift, and you know it, 4 walls and a broken clock, and 4 old women to feed on nothing. Let me take that off your hands too. Go back to, where is it, your father's parish, wherever you've friends. I'll give you £30 to set you on the road, and no ill will on either side, and I'll see to the women myself in a Christian way, whatever's said of me. £30 is £30 to a young woman with no husband and no living. Think on it. You needn't answer me tonight. I shall not answer you tonight, Eleanor agreed. There's sense. He smiled, well pleased with her, mistaking her entirely, and she let him. May I? He gestured to the deed still lying face up on the board. I'll leave it a moment, if it eases Treadwell's mind. No, keep it before you. Look your fill. I've the copy safe. I've nothing to hide, that's the plain truth of me. An honest deed fears no daylight. And there he made his one mistake, for Eleanor took him at that word and looked her fill. She drew the single candle nearer and bent her head over the deed of sale as though she were only a puzzled young woman trying to make out the crabbed law hand, and she let Silas think it was so. And she read it through, with the whole of the attention she had spent these 6 years keeping her father's parish accounts. Every marriage fee and burial due and quarter's tithe entered in her own hand, every farthing that came into the box and every farthing that went out, so that she had a mind that could not read a paper of dates and sums without the numbers standing up out of it of their own accord and asking to be reconciled. The body of it was smooth enough. She read the recitals, the description of the lands, the church close, the long mere, the 2 cottages at Watermouth and their gardens, the mill-leet rents, all set out as Jonas Fenwick, warden, conveying to Silas Fenwick, gentleman, of Bristol, in consideration of the sum, and so on, the words running in their proper grooves. The signature at the foot was very like. The seal was there, red and round and true. Thomas Rudge his mark, Amos Kello his mark, witnesses, a Bristol attorney's engrossment, close and correct. And then she came to the clause that fixed the sum and the terms, and there, quiet, small, buried in the middle of a line where no one racing down the page for the signature would ever have paused, a wrongness rose up off the paper and stood in front of her, together with the rents and profits reserved to the vendor for the quarter then current, being the quarter reckoned from this Lady Day past. She did not move. She kept her face bent and easy over the sheet, and her ink-stained forefinger resting on the margin as though she were only spelling out the law Latin. But the number in her had stood up and would not sit again. The deed was dated at its head. She had read the date twice already without letting it mark her. The 4th day of June, in the year 1815, a Tuesday. She knew it for a Tuesday the way she knew her own name, because the 4th of June was the old king's birthday, and every year of her life her father had rung the church bells for it and entered the ringer's bier in the vestry book, and last year, in the year the deed was dated, the 4th had fallen on a Tuesday. For she had written it so in her father's own accounts with her own hand, June 4. Tuesday, ringers, twos. But the clause spoke of this Lady Day past as though Lady Day were close behind them, the quarter then current, and Lady Day was the 25th of March, the spring quarter day, and a deed made in June could not honestly call the March Lady Day this Lady Day past and reserve its quarter as then current, for by June that quarter was months gone, and the midsummer quarter was all but come. A man selling in June reserved to himself the midsummer rents, not the Lady Day rents 3 months cold. It was the small slip of a man who had sat down with a false paper and the wrong year's almanac before him, and copied a form of words without minding that the calendar had turned. A man reckoning by 1 year's quarters and dating by another's, so that the two would not lie down together. And there was worse, if she was right, and she thought she was, though she would say nothing of it here. For Lady Day in the year of the date had not fallen where his form of words wanted it to fall. She would have to prove it with the almanac in her hand and the diocesan calendar beside it before she would trust it further than a suspicion, but the shape of the thing was there. The small mortal wrongness of a date that would not answer to itself, and she had seen it, and she folded it away in her mind exactly as she had folded Jonas Fenwick's black-edged letter along its old creases in the cold nave 40 miles south, and she said nothing at all. She sat back from the candle and lifted her face to him, composed as a still pond. "It is a great deal of law for a plain woman," she said. "I thank you for letting me look at it, Mr. Fenwick. You have been very patient with my ignorance. It's no matter for a woman to trouble her head with," he said kindly, and gathered the deed, and squared it with the others, and tied the black tape, and rose, well satisfied with the evening's work. "You'll come to see the sense of it. You've a week. I'll be at the Anchor in the village. They've given me a decent room, better than I looked for in such a place. Send to me there when you've thought, or don't send. And I'll come to you at week's end, and we'll settle it like Christians. Treadwell, good night to you. Write to Cundy. Ease your mind." He drew on his gloves at last, finger by finger, and at the door he paused and looked back at the 4 beds and the low fire and the old women drawn against the wall, and he smiled at all of it as a man smiles at a field he means to plow. "A melancholy place," he said again, softly. "It'll be the better for a firm hand." And he went out into the dark, and they heard his good boots go away down the lane toward the village and the lamp of the Anchor. For a while no one spoke. The fire ticked. Mr. Treadwell sat down again heavily on the settle and took off his spectacles and pressed his fingers to his eyes, and when he spoke his voice was that of a man ashamed. "It is very like his hand, Miss Price. I would not have you set your hope too high. I have seen forged papers broken in court, but I have seen more forged papers stand, when the hand is close and the seal is true and the witnesses will swear. I am an old country lawyer, and that is a Bristol deed with a Bristol seal, and I am afraid of it. I will not lie to you. I am afraid of it." "I know you are," Eleanor said gently. "You have been honest with me from the first hour, and I shall not forget it." It was then that Widow Hesketh got up from her place against the wall and came out into the firelight, slow on her sticks but upright, her sharp old face set hard, and she stood over the 2 of them and looked from the lawyer to the young woman and back again. "Confused," she said. She made the word sound like something she had bitten and found rotten. "That man told you the master was confused. His mind gone soft. Debts he was ashamed of." She struck the flagstone once with the ferrule of her stick. "I dressed his supper the night before they found him, and I sat with him while he ate it, for he'd taken to not eating unless a body sat by, and we talked of the roof lead wanting mending, and the price of coals, and whether the Watermouth cottage should be new thatched come spring, and he reckoned the whole of it in his head faster than I could say it. Every figure, as he'd done these 30 years. His mind was clear as spring water to his last week in this world, and I'll swear it before any magistrate in Devon and be glad to. Sold the land? He'd have burned this house down over his own head, and us in it with his blessing, before ever he'd have signed away the women's bread to that oiled town rat. I nursed him. I knew him. I tell you he did not do it." She stood a moment longer, breathing hard, and then some of the fierceness went out of her and she looked older and very tired, and she lowered herself onto the end of the settle beside Treadwell as if her legs had asked leave at last. "He said a strange thing," she said, quieter now, into the fire. "The last day I truly had my wit's worth of talk from him. He was up in the turret with his oil can, tending the clock as he did every 7th day, winter and summer, all the years I knew him. And I called up to him, was he not too old to be climbing them stairs? And he called back down that a clock kept honest was worth an old man's knees. And then he said, I marked it, for it was queer, he said, Bess, the truth keeps better time than any of us. When I'm gone, mind you they wind the clock. She looked up, and her black eyes went from Treadwell's face to Eleanor's and held there. Mind you they wind the clock. That's what he said to me. And within the week he was dead on the workshop floor, and the clock above stopped dead the same hour, and it stood stopped at 7 minutes past 4 from that day to this, and no man's touched it since. The words fell into the quiet room and lay there. Eleanor set down the poor box tally she had never quite finished counting, and rose, and went to the low window at the end of the passage from which, in the last gray of the daylight, one could just see the squat black shape of the turret against the darkening moor, and the two hands of the stopped clock fixed where they had been fixed for 3 months, at 7 minutes past the hour of 4. You will not know me, but I knew your mother's name, and that is enough. Wind the clock. She had carried that line 40 miles with no notion of its meaning, and here it was again, spoken now by a dying man to an old woman by a workshop fire. Mind you, they wind the clock, the same charge laid twice, from the grave, upon 2 different women, as though Jonas Fenwick had known that between them they would understand it in time. Mr. Treadwell, she said, without turning from the window, and her low voice was quite even. In the morning I mean to go up into the turret and open the clock. The narrow stair to the turret smelled of cold brass and pigeon dust, and Eleanor climbed it with a candle in one hand and Jonas Fenwick's ledger pressed flat against her side, because she would not leave the book behind now that it had begun to speak to her. She had spent the better part of 2 days at his workbench with that ledger open under the lamp, and what it told her had settled into her chest like a stone she meant to carry all the way to a magistrate. She had kept her father's parish accounts for 11 years. She knew the shape of an honest book the way a shepherd knows the shape of his own hill in the dark. Jonas's ledger was honest. That was the whole trouble of it, and the whole promise. Page after page in a small, upright hand, the hand of a man who had learned his letters late and been proud of them ever after. Rents received at Lady Day in Michaelmas from the 3 farms of the endowment, Higher Combe and the Water Meadow, and the 2 cottages on the Barnstaple Road, so many pounds, so many shillings, entered to the day, and on the facing pages, the going out of it, penny by penny, to the 4. Coal, 9 loads across the winter. Physic for Widow Tucker's chest, 3 and 6. Candles, A. New blanket when old Mary Coates went through at the foot. Tallow, bread. A shilling to the carrier for bringing Widow Hesketh's daughter's letter down from Taunton, and beside it, in the same faithful hand, a note that the shilling was the warden's own, and not the trust's, lest anyone should ever think the women's bread had paid for a private kindness. That was the man. That was the whole of him, laid out in columns. A man who wrote down a shilling of his own money so that no ghost of a doubt should ever fall on the 4 women's account. And nowhere in all those years was there a line for £800. She had gone through it 3 times to be certain, her ink-stained forefinger moving down each column, and Treadwell had gone through it a 4th while she watched, his half-moon spectacles slipped to the very end of his nose and his lips moving as he read. £800. Silas's deed named it plainly. The endowment lands sold to Silas Fenwick for the sum of £800, received and acknowledged. A sum like that was not a farthing of tallow. A sum like that was a house, a fortune. a thing a man might build a new life upon. And a man who wrote down 3 and 6 for a bottle of physic, who wrote down his own shilling so it should not be mistaken, that man, had he truly taken 800 pounds into his hand, would have entered it. He could no more have left it out than he could have forgotten his own name. It is not here, Treadwell had said at last, and taken off his spectacles and pressed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers, and when he looked up his old eyes were bright with something between grief and a lawyer's cold interest. Miss Price, there is no reckoning of it anywhere. No sale entered, no sum received, no lands struck off the rent roll. According to this book, the endowment stands entire to the day he died, and every quarter's rent went to the 4 women, as it had for 30 years. Then the book says he never sold it. The book says so. But the book is not a deed. He had set his spectacles down carefully on the bench, in the little clear space between a tray of brass wheels and a saucer of oil grown thick and dark. A court will look at a sealed deed with 2 witnesses and a signature before it looks at a dead man's housekeeping. Silence is not proof, Miss Price, however loud it speaks to you and me. A clever man for Silas will say the old fellow was ashamed of the sale, or too far gone in his wits to enter it, that the very absence of it proves his mind was going, which is the tale they mean to tell. The book helps us. It will not save us. For that we want the thing itself. We want the trust, the founding deed that says what these lands are and whose they are, and whether any warden living had the power to sell so much as a hedge of them. And Eleanor had looked up from the ledger, across the workshop of stopped clocks, the wall of them, long case and bracket and carriage, every pendulum dead, every hand halted at its own separate hour, so that the whole wall was a silent congregation of frozen time, and up, as though she could see through the stone toward the turret. In the clock. He always said the truth kept time. So now she climbed. Behind her came young Tom Hesketh, the widow's grandson, a raw-boned lad of 16 with his grandmother's sharp eye and none yet of her sharp tongue, carrying the second lamp and a bag of the old man's tools that Eleanor had chosen at the bench, a set of fine files, a brass-headed hammer, no bigger than a spoon, a candle end, and a folded square of clean flannel to lay small things upon so that nothing should be lost in the dark of the tower. The turret room was scarcely larger than a horse-box, floored with wide oak boards silvered by age and the droppings of birds, and the cold in it was a different cold from the cold of the house below. A still, iron, standing cold. The cold of a place shut up and forgotten. Above them the 4 dials looked outward through the stone, and here within was the heart of the thing. The movement. A black iron framed the height of Eleanor's waist, its great wheels and pinions furred gray with dust and gummed with the varnish that oil becomes when 30 winters have passed over it. From the frame rose the long crank of the hands, and from it, down through a hole in the boards, ran the lines that carried the weights. Everything stood dead still. The pendulum, a rod as long as a man and tipped with a disc of lead, hung straight down and true, and did not move by so much as a hair, and its stillness in that small, cold room was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever stood beside. Grandmother says it stopped the day they found him, Tom said low, as though the room asked for a low voice. 7 minutes past 4. She won't have it wound. Says it's bad luck to wind a dead man's clock. He swallowed. But you're the warden now, so, Eleanor agreed, and set her candle in the old man's holder. A wrought spike driven into the beam, where it had plainly stood 1,000 nights while Jonas worked. The flame steadied and threw the great wheel's shadows huge and trembling on the curved stone. Hold your lamp up, Tom, and to my left. I want the light to fall across the works, not into my eyes." He did as he was told, and she looked. She was no clockmaker. She said as much to herself, plainly the way she said all things to herself, to keep from hoping past what she knew. But she was a woman who had spent her life among mechanisms of another kind. The mechanism of an account, the way one figure drives another, the way a false entry snags the eye of anyone who knows how the true ones run. And a clock, she thought, standing in the cold and letting her steady gray eyes travel over the frame, is only an account of the hours. It adds them up. It carries the tens. Every wheel drove the next in an order as fixed as arithmetic, and if she could not name the parts, she could at least see where they wished to turn and where something stopped them from turning. She found it in less time than she had feared. She had almost expected it, if she were honest, had climbed the stair half knowing. Because Widow Hesketh's words had lodged in her and would not come loose, the truth kept time. A man did not say a thing like that of an idle habit. A man said a thing like that when he meant it for a hiding place and could not, dying, say it plainer. Low in the frame, behind the largest of the wheels, the going train, she would learn to call it, the train that drove the hands, where the teeth of one wheel should have meshed clean into the leaves of the pinion below, something pale was wedged. Not dust, not the gray furring of neglect. A folded thing, packed in tight and deliberate, dark with oil where the oil had soaked it, but pale at the creases where it had not, and jammed so that the wheel above it could turn only a little way and then must stop. Its tooth brought up hard against the obstruction like a cartwheel against a stone. "There," she said softly. "Tom, bring the light close. Do you see it?" "There, behind the big wheel." He leaned in, and his young breath smoked white in the lamplight. Is that paper, miss?" "I believe it is paper." Her voice did not change, but her heart had begun a slow, hard beat that she could feel in the ink-stained finger she raised toward the works. She thought of the wall of stopped clocks below. Every one of them halted, she understood now, not by neglect, but perhaps by grief, the old man letting his whole workshop fall silent as his own hour came on. But this clock, the great one, the turret clock that ruled the village and told the four women when to rise and when to pray and when their bread was due, this one he had not merely let stop. This one he had reached into, with his old careful clockmaker's hands, and stopped, on purpose, by driving a folded paper into its very heart. He had halted time itself over comb marrow to keep something safe inside it. 7 minutes past 4. The hour he was found. She wondered, and would ask the widow, whether he had climbed this stair on his last morning with the packet already folded in his coat, whether the winding of the clock had been the last thing his heart did before it failed him at his post, and the stopping of it his last defiance, so that the theft could not be worked while the truth lay wedged in the works where only an honest hand thinking honestly would think to look. She did not say any of this aloud, but she stood a moment longer than she needed to, in the iron cold, and let it be true. Then she went to work, because feeling was well enough and work was better. "I shan't force it," she told Tom, as much to steady her own hands as to instruct him. "If I drag it out by main strength, I may tear it, and if I tear it, I may lose the very words we want. We go slow. Bring the flannel, spread it there, on the board, flat. Anything I take out goes onto the flannel and nowhere else. Nothing into a pocket, nothing set down on the dust." She chose the smallest of Jonas's files, a slip of steel no broader than a straw, and with it she began, very gently, to work the packet free, not pulling but easing, a little this side and a little that, the way she had once eased a swollen page apart from the register when the damp had glued 2 years of burials together. First, she must relieve the pressure of the wheel above. She found, by looking, that if she turned the great wheel back by a quarter tooth, carefully, with the brass-headed hammer's handles set against a spoke and the gentlest of pushes, the tooth lifted off the paper and the packet loosened in its bed. "Hold the wheel there," she breathed. "Just so. Don't let it fall back. Your 2 hands on it, boy, and don't let go whatever I do." Tom set down his lamp on the flannel's edge and took the cold spoke in both hands, his jaw set, his knuckles whitening, and held it as if his grandmother's whole life hung on it, which, Eleanor thought, in its way it did. And with the wheel lifted off, she slid the files flat under the edge of the packet and coaxed, and felt it give, a slow, reluctant, oil-thick yielding, the paper coming away from the iron with a faint, tacky whisper that was, to her ear, in that silence, as loud as a seal breaking. It came out all at once at the end, as such things do, so that she nearly sat down with the suddenness of it, a flat folded packet the size of her 2 hands, wrapped in oiled paper gone amber and translucent with age and the clock's own grease, and tied about with a thin band of what had once been red tape and was now the brown of old blood. She held it in both her ink-stained hands and did not, for a moment, move at all. "You may let the wheel go now, Tom," she said. "Gently let it come back." He eased it, and above them, without a sound, freed of its obstruction, the great going train wheel settled a fraction into its neighbor, and the whole standing mechanism seemed to sigh, not to move, for the weights were run down and the pendulum still hung dead, but to ease, like a held breath let slowly out, like a thing that has been clenched a long season and is at last permitted to unclench. Somewhere in the frame a pinion shifted a hair and clicked, one small dry click in the iron cold, and Tom started and looked at her wide-eyed, and Eleanor found she had to steady her own voice. "It wants to go," she said. "Do you feel it?" "The clock. Now the paper's out of its throat, it wants to keep time again." She looked at the freed works, at the pendulum that hung so ready, and something moved in her that was not far from tears and was closer, she thought, to a kind of fierce, quiet gladness. "We'll wind it. But not yet. First this." She carried the packet to the board and knelt before it as though before an altar, and set the candle nearer, and untied the perished tape with fingers that she made be steady. The oiled wrapper crackled and gave. Within was a second wrapping, dry, clean, untouched by the grease. He had thought of that too. The careful old man. An inner skin to keep the words safe from the very oil of the hiding place. And within that, folded in 3 and sealed with a blot of black wax into which someone long ago had pressed the device of a little tower, was a document of good heavy parchment, browned at its edges but whole, its ink faded to the color of strong tea, but every letter of it standing clear. Eleanor read the first line, and then read it again, and Tom, watching her face in the candlelight, asked in a whisper what it said. Was it the thing? Was it what they wanted? "It is a deed," she said slowly. "A deed of trust." Her eye went down the crabbed old engrossing hand, the long formal words unrolling, "This indenture, made the 4th day of May in the year of our Lord 1761, down past the names of men 50 years dead, down to the heart of it, the granting clause, and there her steady voice caught for the first time since she had opened a black-edged letter in a cold nave 40 miles and a lifetime away. She read it aloud, into the iron cold, to the boy and to the freed clock and to the 4 sleeping women below, and to the old man who had died at his post to keep these very words alive. To have and to hold the said messages, lands and rents unto the use of the poor women of the parish of Clockmaker, and their successors in that estate forever, the same to be held and administered by a warden, who shall be steward only and no owner, and who shall have no power, license, nor authority whatsoever to sell, mortgage, alienate, or in any wise encumber the said endowment or any part thereof, the same being given to the poor forever, and not to be sold. She let the words settle in the cold. No power whatsoever to sell. She thought of Silas Fenwick's green coat, and his smiling condolence, and his sealed deed of sale, dated a Tuesday that had wanted to be a Monday, conveying to himself for £800 that were never received the lands that this parchment said, in the plain, hard voice of 1761, no warden living had the smallest right to sell. A man cannot sell what is not his. Jonas had never owned these fields. He had only kept them, as a shepherd keeps another man's flock, and Silas's grand forged deed conveyed exactly nothing, because there had been nothing in Jonas's hand to convey. It was void, void on its face, void by its own founding law, and she had it now in her 2 ink-stained hands by the light of a dead man's candle. "Is it good, miss?" Tom whispered. "Does it beat him?" "It beats him," she said, very low, and found she was not quite able to say more for a moment. And then she saw that the parchment was not alone. Folded into the last leaf of it, tucked so close against the founding deed that at first she had taken it for a part of the same skin, was a second paper, newer, thinner, a letter of ordinary rag paper folded small and sealed with a plain daub of the same black wax. No little tower pressed into this one. Only on its face, in a hand she did not know, a shaking hand, the hand of the enclosed note she already carried, the dying hand that had written, "You will not know me, but I knew your mother's name," a direction. Not to Miss Eleanor Price, not to the parson's daughter, nor the warden, nor the owner of Fenwick's Rest. To a name she had seen only in the front of her mother's Bible, and on the worn stone in the Clockmaker churchyard she had not yet been told to look for. Her mother's name, her mother's own maiden name, written out full by a man who had folded it into the heart of a stopped clock and set it, of all the papers in the world, next against the deed that saved the poor women forever. Eleanor knelt in the cold turret with the Founder's Justice open on the flannel before her, and this small sealed letter in her fingers, the candle steady, the freed clock waiting overhead to be wound, and for a long moment she did not break the black wax. She only looked at her mother's name in a stranger's dying hand, and understood, without yet knowing a single word of what the letter would tell her, that she had not come north to a stranger's house at all. She read it once, standing, and then she sat down on the workshop stool because her knees told her to, and read it again with the packet of oiled paper still cool between her fingers. The second enclosure had been folded inside the first, smaller. The direction written not to Miss Eleanor Price, but to the daughter of Margaret Combe, her mother's maiden name, the name Eleanor had only ever seen on the flyleaf of an old psalter, in a girlish hand her mother had long outgrown by the time Eleanor knew her at all. Margaret Combe. Clockmaker. She had not put the two together in all her days upon the road, and she put them together now, sitting in a dead man's chair with a dead man's clockwork breathing dust around her, and something in her chest went very still and very warm at once. The lamp threw its small circle. Beyond it the wall of stopped clocks kept their silence, all those hands frozen at their several hours, and the turret above her freed at last and wanting to move. She unfolded the letter along the crease he had made and read what Jonas Fenwick had wanted her to know before he would let her know anything else. He wrote as a man writes who knows his hand is failing and means to say the whole of it before it does. There had been a girl, he wrote, in this very house, 40 years gone and more, one of the Charity's children, taken in as an infant when her people died of the fever, the same winter the old warden did, raised on the endowment's bread in the room where the 4 women slept now. Margaret, he had been a young man then, apprenticed to the clockmaker who had the shop before him, and he had loved her the way a young man loves who has nothing to offer but his 2 hands and the promise of a trade. He had meant to marry her. He wrote it plainly, without ornament, the way an honest ledger states a sum. But a curate had come through Combe Marrow that spring, a serious young man bound for a living in the South, and Margaret had a quickness in her and a hunger for a wider life than a village clockmaker could give, and she had gone with the curate, married him decently in this church, and become in time the parson's wife of a parish 40 miles off. And Jonas had wound his clocks and kept his charge, and never married at all. Eleanor read that and set her ink-stained finger against the page as if to keep her place, though she had no thought of losing it. Her father. The serious young curate bound south was her own father, whom she had buried a month since. The quickness and the hunger were her mother's, whom she had buried at 15 and grieved every day of the 11 years after. She had known her mother as a tired, gentle woman with a low voice and chapped hands, who could reckon a column of figures faster than the parish clerk, and who had taught Eleanor to do the same at the kitchen table with a stub of pencil. She had not known her mother had ever been a foundling in a Devon almshouse, or that a man had loved her enough to keep faith with her memory for 40 years and leave her orphan daughter everything he owned. He had watched from a distance, he wrote, as much as a man may watch a life he has no part in. He had heard when Margaret died, and grieved for her privately as he had no right to grieve. He had heard, later, of the parson's daughter who kept her father's accounts and was said in the neighborhood to be exact and honest and afraid of nobody, heard it from a carrier who did the road between the 2 parishes, the small gossip of the countryside that travels farther than anyone means it to. And when his own strength began to go, and he understood he would leave no child and must leave the house to someone, he had thought of that daughter, and thought of her again, and made up his mind. I might have left it to the church, he wrote, or to Treadwell to sell for the almswomen's keep, and it would have been honest enough. But I know what is coming, and honest is not sufficient against it. I need hands that will not let go. You are Margaret's, and Margaret would sooner have died than see 4 old women turned out of their beds, and I have watched long enough to believe her daughter is the same. That is why. There is no romance in it, and I will ask you to forgive an old man for reaching so far into your life without your leave. Wind the clock, and you will understand the rest. She sat with it a while. The almshouse settled around her in its night noises, the small tick and cool of stone giving up the day's little warmth, one of the women coughing somewhere down the passage and turning over, the wind coming off the moor to lean on the shutters and go on. Eleanor was not a woman who wept easily, and she did not weep now, though her eyes stung and she let them, alone in the lamplight, and did not trouble to wipe them until they had done. Her mother had slept in this house, had been fed on the very rents Silas Fenwick meant to steal, had run out that low door as a girl to be married in that cold church, and had never once, in all the years at the kitchen table, said a word of it, perhaps because a foundling's beginning was a thing a parson's wife did not speak of, perhaps only because the past is a country we do not always take our children to visit. Eleanor found she was not hurt by the silence. She understood it. She had kept her own father's accounts for 6 years, and knew that a life is mostly the sums it does not enter, the griefs carried forward from page to page without a line to name them. But she was Margaret's daughter, and Margaret would not have sat weeping over a letter while 4 women's bread stood in danger, and so, after a decent interval, Eleanor folded the letter once more along its crease, and set it in her breast where she could feel it, and turned her mind, deliberately, to the thing she could do with her hands. She had the packet. She spread it flat on the workshop bench under the lamp, weighting its curling corners with a brass wheel blank at each edge, and read the trust deed through slowly a 3rd time, this time not for the wonder of it, but for the use. The founding instrument of the charity of Fenwick's Rest, engrossed on good parchment in a clerk's careful hand, dated in the reign before this one, reciting how a certain benefactor had settled certain lands and the rents thereof upon the poor women of Combe Marrow, to have and to hold to their use forever, the warden for the time being to administer the same. But here was the clause she wanted, and she read it aloud to be sure of it. Low and even in the empty room, with no power to sell, alien, mortgage, or otherwise dispose of the said lands or any part thereof, the same being settled to the said charitable use in perpetuity. She read it twice. There was no ambiguity in it that she could find, and she had read enough of her father's glebe leases and tithe agreements to know ambiguity when it hid in a phrase. The lands could not be sold, not by Jonas, not by any warden, not by anyone. A warden who put his name to a deed of sale would be putting his name to a thing he had no more power to do than to sell the tower of the parish church or the moon over it. Silas's deed, whatever it purported, conveyed nothing, because there was nothing in the warden's gift to convey. That was the ground of it, and it was firm ground. But Eleanor had kept accounts too long to trust a single ground, however firm, when a clever man stood on the other side of it with a sealed paper and a Bristol attorney behind him. A trust deed 40 years old might be questioned, might be said to be superseded, might be met with some story of a later instrument giving the warden powers the first had withheld. She wanted more than the trust. She wanted the forgery itself broken open, so that no magistrate could look at Silas's deed and be left with even the shadow of a doubt. And she had, folded already in the back of her mind where she had put it that afternoon and left it, the beginning of a thread to pull. She waited for the morning and for Treadwell, and did not go to her bed until she had made a fair copy of the trust clause in her own neat hand, that being a thing worth doing whether or not anyone asked it of her. Treadwell came up from Barnstaple the next day with the frost still white in the lane, his half-moon spectacles fogging the moment he stepped from the cold into the warmth of the shared hearth, and Eleanor gave him a chair and a cup of the women's tea and let him read the trust deed himself before she said a word of what she thought. She had learned long ago that a lawyer wants to find a thing for himself. You do not tell him the sum. You set the figures before him and let him add. He read it with his lips moving very slightly and his thumb going down the lines, and when he reached the clause of inalienability he stopped and read it again, and set the parchment down on his knee and looked at her over the spectacles. He could not have sold it, Treadwell said, whatever he signed, whatever Silas holds. If this is the founding instrument and it is genuine, and it has every mark of being genuine, the recital, the seal, the hand of it, then Jonas Fenwick held these lands as a steward and no more, and a steward cannot sell the thing he stewards. The deed of sale is void, not doubtful, void on its face, the moment this is laid beside it. He took his spectacles off and polished them, which she had come to know was the thing he did when he was moved and did not wish to show it. I have been 40 years at this trade, Miss Price, and I did not sleep 3 nights for the fear of that sealed deed of Silas's. And it was in the clock the whole time. In the clock. He said the truth kept time, Eleanor said. So it did. Treadwell put his spectacles back on. So it did, and he stopped the clock to keep it. 7 minutes past 4. He was quiet a moment, and she let him be. Then, because he was a methodical man and the wonder passed and the work remained, he squared himself in the chair and said, "This will serve." But he will fight it. Silas will say this deed is a forgery, or spent or overborne by a later grant. He will say anything, and he has an attorney's seal to say it with. I should be easier if the sale itself could be shown false and not merely powerless. It can, Eleanor said. She had his whole attention then. She did not hurry. She fetched from the bench the ledgers she had gone through by lamplight 2 nights running and set them before him, and showed him first the plain fact of the silence, that in all Jonas's years of exact entry, the coal and the physic and the candles and the tallow reckoned to the farthing. The rents received each quarter and paid out to the 4. There was nowhere any entry of £800 received, or of any sum received, for the sale of the endowment lands, that a man who noted the price of a pound of nails would not have failed to note the receipt of the whole worth of the charity's ground, that the sale, if it had happened without leaving so much as a shilling's shadow in the accounts of the most exact man in Devon. Absence is not proof to a jury, she said, before he could say it. I know. A man may be paid and not enter it. But it is one weight in the scale, and it weighs true, and I would put it in. I would put it in, Treadwell agreed. Then here is the other. And now she came to the thing she had carried folded since the afternoon Silas had let her hold his deed, confident, in this same room. She had seen it then and said nothing, and she had told no one, not Treadwell, not Hesketh, wanting to be sure of it before she spoke, wanting to have the calendars under her hand and not merely her memory. His deed is dated the 17th of a Tuesday in the autumn quarter, and in the body of it, reciting the lands and their rents, it names the quarter rents as accrued this Lady Day past. Lady Day, the 25th of March. She looked at him steadily. Mr. Treadwell, a man drawing a true deed in the autumn, does not reckon his rents from Lady Day. He reckons them from Michaelmas, from the 29th of September, the quarter just gone. To reach back past a whole quarter to Lady Day is the sort of slip a man makes when he is not living inside the year he is writing, when he is copying a form, or working from an old almanac, and has the wrong quarter day under his eye. Treadwell was very still, listening. That is only strange, she went on. This is worse. I have here, she drew them out, the 2 small books she had begged, one the parish calendar her father had kept, and one a diocesan almanac Treadwell himself had brought at her asking without knowing yet why she wanted it, the reckoning of the days. And Lady Day that year, the year his deed is dated, the year he says the rents accrued, Lady Day that year fell upon a Monday. But look how he has written it. She set her ink-stained finger on the copy she had made of the phrase. He writes of the Tuesday of Lady Day last, as though the feast fell on a Tuesday. It did not. Not that year. That year it was a Monday, and I have 2 calendars to say so, and the church's own register of the Annunciation service to say so a 3rd time if we send for it. A man reckoning honestly from his own year's rents does not misname the very day the feast fell on. But a forger, sitting in Bristol with the wrong year's almanac open before him, a year in which Lady Day did fall upon a Tuesday, copies the day out of his book and sets it in his deed, and never knows he has written down the one thing that proves He was not where he says he was. In the year he says he was in it. There was a silence in the warm room. Down the passage, one of the women was singing, very quietly, over some small task, an old tune with no words that Eleanor could hear. "Wrong almanac," Treadwell said at last, softly, as a man says a thing he is turning all the way over. He worked from the wrong year's almanac. He took off his spectacles again and this time did not polish them, only held them. "Miss Price, I have drawn deeds and read deeds and broken one or two in my time, and I never in my life caught a forger by the day of the week. That is," he searched for it, "that is your father's daughter in you. Or your mother's. That is an accounts-keeping eye, and no mistake." "It is my mother's," Eleanor said, and did not explain, and he did not ask. He put the ledgers and the calendars together in a neat stack, squaring their edges with his two hands the way she squared hers, and she saw that he had become, in the last quarter hour, not merely her ally but her partisan, that some caution in him that had held even while he hoped had let go, and he was hers now to the end of it. "There is a thing I can add," he said, "that you cannot, being new to the country. The witnesses. Every deed must have its witnesses, and Silas's has two, named at the foot in the usual form. Men who set their hands to say they saw Jonas sign upon that Tuesday. I did not think much of them when first I saw the deed, for witnesses are commonly nobodies. A clerk and a stableman got in off the street. But one of the names, Coombe, it is written, though spelled unlike our village, one of the names I believe I know, or know of, from a matter of debt that came through my hands 2 winters gone. A Bristol man, and a bad one for money. He tapped the stack. If it is the same man, and I can learn where he was upon that Tuesday, and there are ways of learning it, the Gales keep their books as we keep ours, then we shall see whether a man can witness a deed in Combe Marrow while he is sitting in a Bristol lockup for debt. I will write tonight. I have a correspondent in the city who owes me a service and keeps a long memory. Write tonight, Eleanor said, and it was the first time in the whole business she had heard her own voice give an order, and she found it did not trouble her. So the days closed in around the work, and it was good work, the kind she knew, patient, papered, exact. A matter of laying one true thing beside another until the shape of a lie stood out against them all. Treadwell wrote his letter to Bristol, and Eleanor watched it go with the carrier in the frost. She copied the calendar's fair, and set the day of Lady Day beyond dispute, sending a boy the 7 miles to the next parish to bring back a sworn line from their register too, so that no one could say her father's book was got up to suit her. She went again through every ledger Jonas had left, page by lamplit page, and satisfied herself past any doubting that the man had never in his life received the price of the lands he was said to have sold. And in the evenings, when the women were abed and the hearth burned low, she climbed once to the turret with the lamp and stood a while by the freed movement, not touching it yet, not until it should be safe, not until the thing was won and Jonas's clock could be set going in a house that was surely the women's own, and looked at the hands stopped still at 7 minutes past 4, the hour he had died and the hour he had chosen, and thought that she would like, when it was over, to be the one to wind it. Widow Hesketh watched all this with her sharp old eyes and said little, but she took to sitting near Eleanor of an evening with her mending, and one night, without being asked, she said, "Your mother. You've the look of her about the mouth, now I know to see it. Margaret, she used to sit just there, by the fire, mending same as this, when she was a girl and I was a young woman not so much older, quick with her needle, quicker with her tongue." The old woman bit off a thread. Jonas never said a word of you being hers. Mind, not to me, not to any. Carried it 40 years and told it to a letter. That was him all over. She looked at Eleanor across the low light. He'd have liked to see you catch that snake out by the wrong day of the week. That's a thing he'd have laughed at. He did love a clock that told the truth, and a lie that told on itself. Eleanor said that she thought she would have liked him, and found that she meant it, and that the meaning cost her a small warm ache she was glad of. When Treadwell's answer came from Bristol at the week's end, and it came sooner than she had feared and worse for Silas than she had dared to hope, Eleanor read it standing at the workshop bench, and then set it down beside the deed and the ledgers and the calendars, the whole quiet armory of it laid out in a row, and knew the thing was ready. She would not spring it in a passion. She would not meet Silas with fury, though she had cause. Fury was his weapon, and a poor one, and she had better. She would meet him with the papers, in the daylight, before the magistrate, with the 4 women in the room and Treadwell at her side, and every true thing laid down in order for any honest man to read. She sent word to Barnstaple for the day to be fixed, and word to the inn where Silas kept his lodging that the parson's daughter would be glad to see him before the justice on such a morning, and had her answer to give him then. He does not knock. The door of the Almshouse hall swings inward on its old iron hinge, and Silas Fenwick comes in out of the pale morning, with his green coat brushed and his boots blacked, a leather case under his arm, and his forger's deed already half drawn from it, as though the matter were settled, and he had come only to sign. Behind him the frost still whitens the yard. Within, the long, low room has been swept and warmed against him, a fire built up in the great hearth, the 4 narrow beds made and empty, a plain deal table set square in the middle of the flagstones with 3 chairs upon the far side of it. The magistrate, Sir Henry Combe, sits already in the middle chair, a heavy man with a countryman's red face and a diocesan calm, his gloves laid crossed before him. Mr. Treadwell sits at his right, half-moon spectacles pushed up, a bundle of papers under his folded hands. And at the left, in her mended dove gray wool with her bonnet off and her auburn hair plain, sits Eleanor Price, who does not rise when Silas enters, and who watches him come across the room the way one watches a clock one already knows is wrong. The 4 almswomen sit along the wall by the fire. Widow Hesketh in her best cap, her hands folded on her stick, her mouth a hard line. The others small and gray and frightened beside her, having been told they might be turned out by noon. Sir Henry. Silas made his bow, easy and warm, spreading the greeting round the room like a man dealing cards. Mr. Treadwell, Cousin Eleanor. The smile came before he had anything to smile about, which she had learned was his way. I'm glad you called us together. I had rather this were done kindly, among family, than dragged through any court in Barnstaple. Grief makes tangles. I've come to untangle. Sit, Mr. Fenwick, said Sir Henry, not unkindly. You've asked this hearing, and Miss Price has agreed to it. Let us hear you. Silas drew out the chair opposite them, set his case upon the table, and did not sit at once. He preferred, she saw, to stand while others sat. It let him look down. He laid a hand flat upon the leather as a preacher lays his hand upon the book. The matter is a sad one and a simple one, he began. My Uncle Jonas, God rest him, was a good man once, and a clever one, but he was old, and this last year or 2 his mind had gone to seed. You'll not like to hear it, he said, turning his smile gently upon Widow Hesketh, you that loved him. But an old man may be loved and be failing both. He fell behind. The rents did not stretch, and rather than see his charity founder, he did the sensible thing, the very thing I'd have counseled him myself. He sold the endowment lands, that were a millstone about his neck, to one of his own blood who could carry them better, namely to me. He undid the strap of his case then, unhurried, and drew the deed out full length, and turned it so it lay before the magistrate the right way up, the great Bristol seal at its foot like a red coin pressed in wax. There it is, Sir Henry. A deed of sale, dated the 14th of last October. My uncle's own hand, Mr. Treadwell, will not deny he knew that signature these 30 years. 2 witnesses. An attorney's seal. £800 paid over, which was a fair price, and more than fair for land that scarce paid its own tithe. He spread his fingers upon it. I don't come to be cruel. The women may stay the winter, I'm no monster. But the lands are mine, bought and paid, and the house Jonas left to my cousin here is hers to keep or sell as she likes. I make her no quarrel over the house, only the endowment is mine. That's the whole of it. It was smoothly done. Eleanor saw the smaller almswomen look at one another, half believing, because he said it so reasonably, and she saw Treadwell's jaw tighten, for the old solicitor had feared exactly this, that said plainly, in a warm room, before a tired magistrate, the lie would sound more like sense than the truth would. Sir Henry drew the deed toward him and read it slowly, holding it to the window light. The signature is his, Treadwell? Treadwell leaned and looked long, and would not lie even to help his own side. It is very like his, Sir Henry, very like. I'll not swear against it on the side alone. There, said Silas softly. You see. And now Sir Henry turned his heavy patient face to Eleanor. Miss Price, you've heard the claim. You asked to be heard against it. The floor is yours, and I'll tell you honestly, I see a sealed deed and a signature not denied. And unless you've more than a niece's grief to set against it, I must find for Mr. Fenwick. Have you more? Eleanor had not moved through the whole of it. Her ink-stained forefinger lay along the edge of the table. When she spoke it was low, and even, as she spoke everything, and the smaller women leaned to hear her, for she did not raise her voice to fill a room, she made the room come to her. I have more, Sir Henry. But before I set anything before you, I should like Mr. Fenwick to say a thing plainly, so that we are all sure what he claims. Not to trap him, only so there's no mistaking it after. Ask, said Sir Henry. She turned her steady gray eyes on Silas for the first time. Cousin, you say Jonas sold these lands to you, so the rents that come off them, the land at Nethercot, the 2 closes by the mill, the glebe strip, those rents are now your own money, to spend as you please, and the 4 women here live on them only by your good will, as your tenants. Is that your claim? Have I it right? He should have felt the ground then. But he was a man who had smiled his way through 100 rooms, and he took her mildness for weakness, and he wanted it on the record as much as she did, the generous conqueror, granting the women their winter. You have it exactly, cousin, he said, and inclined his head, almost gallant. The endowment is my private property, freely bought. The women are my tenants at will. I'll not turn them out unkindly, but the rents are mine, in law and in right, and no man living can say otherwise. No man living, Eleanor repeated, and something in the way she said it made him look at her more closely, though he could not yet have said why. Thank you. I wanted it clear. She reached down beside her chair, where a flat wooden box had stood all this while unremarked, a plain thing of oiled deal, and she lifted it to the table and opened the lid. From it she drew a document older by far than his, its parchment gone the color of weak tea, its fold lines soft as cloth from age, a green ribbon through it, and a seal upon the ribbon that was not red, but the dull brown of long years. This, she said, was in the turret clock. behind the going train, wrapped in oiled paper, where Jonas Fenwick put it with his own hands before he died, and where, by putting it, he stopped the clock. It is the deed of trust that founded this house, the founding instrument. It is dated the year 1741, and it is signed by Ambrose Fenwick, Jonas's grandfather, who built these walls and set aside the land to feed the poor women of Combe Marrow when he was gone. She did not hurry. She turned the old parchment so that it, too, lay the right way up before the magistrate, beside the new one, the two of them side by side on the deal, the brown seal and the red. I'll read you the part that matters, Sir Henry. It is not long, and it is very plain, plainer than they write now. She set her forefinger to the line and read, and her low voice went out into the warmed room, and the fire ticked under it. I do give, grant, and settle the said lands of Nethercot, with the mill closes and the glebe strip therewith, unto the use of the poor women of Combe Marrow forever, the same to be held by a warden in trust for them, who shall have the keeping and the ordering of the rents to their sole benefit, but shall have no power to sell, mortgage, or convey the said lands, nor any part thereof, the same being given to the poor forever, and not to be aliened by any hand. She lifted her finger from the line. Not to be aliened by any hand, she said again. Quietly, Jonas was the warden. Only the warden. He held these lands, the way I hold the poor box keys of my father's church, to keep, not to own. He could no more sell Nethercot than the sexton could sell the churchyard, or I could sell the font. It was never his. And a man cannot sell what is not his to sell. Whatever Mr. Fenwick paid, if he paid anything, he bought nothing, because there was nothing here for Jonas to convey. His deed of sale is a deed of nothing. It is void upon its face. The room had gone very still. Widow Hesketh's hands had tightened on her stick until the knuckles shone. Silas's smile had not left him, but it had stopped meaning anything. It sat on his face now the way the hands had sat stopped on the clock. A pretty old paper, he said, and his voice was still smooth, but had gone a half-tone higher. Who's to say it's genuine? Who's to say it was ever in the clock, or that you did not find it, or make it, this fortnight past? An old woman's tale and a scrap of parchment. My deed has a Bristol seal and living witnesses. Sir Henry is a man of the world. He'll not overturn a sealed instrument on a bedtime story. I thought you would say that, said Eleanor, and there was no triumph in it, only the same evenness which was worse for him than triumph would have been. So I did not come with only the old paper. I came with yours. She drew from the box a folded sheet in her own neat hand, the parish hand, the account-keeper's hand, ink-stained fingers and all, and she laid it beside his deed. You dated your sale the 14th of October last, Mr. Fenwick, and you were careful. You named the rents in it. You wrote that the sale carried with it the quarter rents due this Lady Day past. I read it the first day you showed it me. I said nothing then. I say it now. She looked up. Lady Day is the 25th of March, Sir Henry, as you know better than I, a quarter day when such rents fall due and are reckoned. But Mr. Fenwick's deed speaks of the rents due this Lady Day past, as though Lady Day and the 14th of October both stood in one accounting, and any man who kept these lands, who lived by their calendar, who knew when Nethercot paid, would never have reckoned an October sale by a Lady Day that fell the way it fell that year. A man working the true books could not have written it so. A man copying a date out of the wrong year's almanac could, and did. She turned to Treadwell, who took up the thread with the diocesan almanac open before him, his finger on the page, and laid the calendars together for the magistrate, the parish reckoning against the printed year, and showed him where the count would not close, where the forger, working from a stranger's almanac in a Bristol back room, had set down a quarter he could not have counted had he ever once stood in this yard on a rent day. "It is a small thing," Eleanor said. "It is one wrong Tuesday in a fair copy, but an honest deed of Jonas's own making could not carry it, and a forgery worked from the wrong almanac must. I have kept parish books 8 years, Sir Henry. I have never yet met a false entry that did not somewhere fail to close. This one fails here." Sir Henry bent over the 2 calendars a long moment, and his red countryman's face had stopped being tired. "And the witnesses," Eleanor went on, gentle and relentless, laying down the last of it. "Your deed names 2, Mr. Fenwick, a John Hollis and a Thomas Pardew, of Bristol, who set their hands to it, you say, on that 14th of October. Mr. Treadwell wrote to Bristol 3 weeks ago to find them, as any careful man would." She looked to Treadwell, who drew out the letter, its seal already broken, and read the line that mattered in his dry, methodical voice, that Thomas Pardew had lain in the debtor's gaol at Bristol Newgate from Michaelmas until past Christmas of that year, entered upon the gaol's own book, and could no more have stood in a back room witnessing a deed that October than he could have flown over the Bridgewater Flats to do it. "He signed nothing," Eleanor said. "He was behind bars the day your deed says he stood at your elbow. So one of your 2 witnesses is a lie the gaol book can prove, and your date is a lie the almanac can prove, and your sale is a nothing the trust deed can prove. And the last of it, Sir Henry, the plainest of all." She turned the wooden box and lifted out the ledgers, the whole neat run of Jonas Fenwick's account books, and set them one upon another with a soft weight of years. Jonas Fenwick wrote down every farthing that ever passed through his hands in this house. Coal and candles and physic for the women, and a shilling to the boy that swept the chimney. I have gone through every page of the last 3 years. There is no £800. There is no sale. There is not one line, not one figure, not one word, to say that any land was ever sold or any money ever received. A man who set down a shilling for a swept chimney did not forget to set down £800 and the loss of his life's charge. It is not there, because it never happened. She closed the ledger. "That is the whole of it, Sir Henry. The lands were given to the poor forever and could not be sold. The date could not have been written by an honest hand that knew this ground. The witness was in gaol. The money was never received. My cousin's deed is a forgery, and it conveys nothing, and the endowment stands where Ambrose Fenwick set it 70 years ago, with the 4 women by that wall." For a moment Silas said nothing at all, and the smile was quite gone now, wiped clean, and what was under it was not pleasant to look on. Then it broke out of him, not smooth any longer. The oil burned off. "This is a plot," he said, loud, and his chair scraped as he came half up from it. "A parson's spinster, and a doting old clerk, and a pack of paupers. And you'd take an honest man's bought property on a riddle about Tuesdays," he caught himself, and tried for the warm voice again, and could not find it, and reached instead for threat. "I'll have counsel from Bristol. I'll have this before the assizes. You'll not strip me on the word of Mr. Fenwick." Sir Henry did not raise his voice either. He did not need to. He had laid one broad hand flat upon the debtor's gaol letter, and the other upon the 2 calendars where they would not close, and he looked up over them at the man in the green coat with a face that had made up its mind. "Sit down." Silas sat. "You'll have no assizes of your own choosing," said the magistrate slowly. "You've stood in my hearing this morning and claimed, on the record, before witnesses, that lands not yours to touch were your private property, bought for 800 pounds under a deed I now have strong cause to believe you forged. A dead witness in Gaol, a date no honest steward would write, a sale no ledger ever saw. That is not a tangle of grief, sir, that is a felony, and it is I who will be sending it up, not you. He drew a slow breath. You'll be bound over to appear, and you'll not go back to Bristol before you've given surety to this court. Treadwell, you'll draw the recognizance. The deed of sale I hold as it stands as evidence. It is void of any force from this moment, and the endowment of this house is what it always was, the freehold charity of the poor women of Combe Marrow, and no man's private purse. He set the red-sealed forgery aside from the brown-sealed truth, deliberately, the width of the table between them. Miss Price is confirmed to me as owner of the house called Fenwick's Rest, under her benefactor's will, and as warden of the trust in his room, to keep these rents to the women's use, as the founder charged. And God help the next that tries to take them. For the paper's out of the clock now, and it won't go back. There was no cheer in the room. It was not that kind of room. But something went out of the four women along the wall. The held breath of people who had been told at breakfast that they might be homeless by dark, and were not. One of the smaller ones began, quietly, to cry, and the woman beside her took her hand. Widow Hesketh did not cry. She sat very straight and looked at Silas Fenwick the whole while the recognizance was being drawn, looked at him steady from under her best cap as though she were fixing his face in her memory to tell it to Jonas when she saw him, and she said, once, low, to no one and to everyone, he always said the truth kept time. I told her. In the clock. Silas signed what Treadwell put before him because there was nothing left to do but sign it. His oiled head bent. The green coat too new for the country creased at the shoulders now where he had come up out of his chair. When he had done, he gathered his empty case and stood, and for one moment he looked at Eleanor across the deal table with the two deeds on it, and whatever he had meant to say, some last smooth thing, some parting cut, did not come. She looked back at him, with her ink-stained hand at rest on the founder's parchment, and her gray eyes level and unfrightened, exactly as she had watched him walk in, and it was he who turned first, and went out past the empty maid beds into the frost, with the constable's man a pace behind him. The door swung to on its old iron hinge. For a little while no one moved. Then Sir Henry gathered his crossed gloves, and Treadwell began, methodically, to gather his papers and his opened letter and his almanac. And the women by the fire began, uncertainly, to talk among themselves in the low, glad way of people learning to believe good news. And Eleanor Price rose from her chair at last and took up the old brown sealed deed of trust and folded it along its soft ancient creases the way she folded everything, and stood a moment with it in her two hands, looking up, not at the door where Silas had gone, but past it, past the low black beams of the ceiling, toward the wall where, 3 floors above them, and stone-cold silent still, the turret clock stood with its hands at 7 minutes past 4, waiting to be wound. The turret bell above Fenwick's Rest struck the half-hour, and Eleanor, at the workshop bench with an oiled wheel between her fingers, paused to listen to it, not because she doubted it any longer, but for the simple pleasure of a true sound. It came down through the stone as it had come down for 100 years before Silas Fenwick ever set his green boot on the moor road even, unhurried. One clean stroke that hung in the cold, and then let go. She set the wheel back on its cloth and wiped her forefinger, which was ink-stained again, for she had spent the morning at Jonas's ledgers, carrying his columns forward in her own upright hand. 6 weeks had gone since the magistrate bound Silas over, and the deed of sale was voided and burned to a curl of ash in the almshouse grate. The house was warm now, in a way it had not been warm in years. The winter coal was laid and dry under the lean-to. The 4 narrow beds had 4 good blankets apiece, and Widow Hesketh had stopped watching the door as though the wolf might come back to it. The trust was safe. The endowment was enshrined forever upon the poor women of Combe Marrow, inalienable, and Eleanor Price, who had come north 40 miles a stranger with a black-edged letter, was warden of it, and mistress of the long grey house. And she kept both the way she had kept her father's parish accounts, to the farthing, and with her whole heart, and without fuss. Her mother's bed at the end of the row was given now to a new woman, a widow named Sarah Combe, whose husband had drowned bringing in the winter herring, and who had nowhere else to go. Eleanor had made the bed herself, smoothing the coverlet flat with both palms, thinking of a girl she had never seen sleeping there 60 years before, a Combe Marrow charity child who had grown up to marry a parson and to bear a daughter, and to die without ever telling that daughter where she was born. She had not wept over it. She had only made the bed well, and set a candle by it, and shown Sarah Combe where the water was drawn, and how the hearth drew best in an east wind. And that had felt more like honoring her mother than any tears would have done. So the days had a shape to them now, and Eleanor moved through them content in a way she had not thought to be again after her father's death. And it was into that even, settled life, on a bright hard morning in the first week of the new year, that the Duke of Aldermore came, though she did not know at first that he was a duke, nor much cared. She was at the bench, as she was most mornings, with the case of the small bracket clock open before her and a fine brush in her hand, when Hesketh's grandson put his head round the workshop door and said there was a gentleman come about the hedge, and would she see him? Eleanor said she would, and did not get up at once, because a wheel half cleaned is worse than a wheel not touched, and she finished her stroke first. When she did rise in turn, wiping her hands, there was a broad-shouldered man standing just inside the door with his hat in his hand, graying at the temples, and he had waited without a word while she finished, which she noticed, because most men would not have. "Miss Price," he said, "I am James Hale. I have the land that runs along your eastern boundary, up past the beach row. There is a hedge there wants seeing to, and a footpath your almswomen use to the wellspring that crosses a corner of my ground, and I thought it better to speak of both plainly than to let them grow into a grievance." He had a low voice and an old fall in his walk, a slight favoring of the left leg that he made no apology for. "I hope I do not take you from your work. You take me from a wheel that has waited 80 years and can wait an hour more," Eleanor said, and set the brush down. "Sit, if you will, Mr. Hale. There is only the one good chair, and it is Jonas's." But he would not grudge it. He sat. He looked about the workshop as a man looks who is genuinely curious and not merely polite. At the wall of clocks, all of them going now, all of them keeping their own true time so that the little room ticked and breathed with them, at the files ranged by size, at the brass wheels laid out on their cloth. He asked her, not idly, what the tall one in the corner was, the one with the deadbeat escapement, and when she told him he nodded as though he had wanted to know and now did. They spoke of the hedge, which was a real hedge and wanted laying before the sap rose, and of the footpath, which he said the women were welcome to keep and welcome to the spring, and he would set a stile in the corner so they need not climb the bank in wet weather. It was all ordinary business, and it took the better part of an hour, and it was only when he had gone, walking back up the beach row with that even, patient limp, that Hesketh came in from the passage where she had plainly been listening the whole while and told Eleanor who the man was. "That's the Duke," Hesketh said, with relish. "Aldermore, him as owns half the north side and never says so. And I'll tell you a thing about him, since he'll not tell it himself." She lowered herself onto the bench end. "Who do you think paid for the coal these 4 winters when Jonas hadn't the rents to do it and wouldn't beg? Come every autumn, a cart of good dry coal and no name to it and no thanks asked. It was him. Jonas knew. Jonas never let on he knew, because the man didn't want it known. Out of respect for Jonas, that was, and for the women. That's your gentleman about the hedge." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. She thought of the man finishing his account of the footpath without once mentioning the coal, and she found she liked him the better for the silence than she would have for any speech. He came again the following week, about the stile, and stayed longer than a stile required, and again when the beech buds were breaking, with a book he thought she might care for, a treatise on the making of the anchor escapement, dry as a stick to any soul but a clockmaker's, and he had marked no passages and made no show of it, only laid it on the bench and said he had 2 and could spare 1. They fell across that slow spring into the way of walking together up to the turret of an afternoon, so that Eleanor could wind the great clock, which she did herself now, every 3rd day, climbing the narrow stair with the key heavy in her apron pocket. He came up behind her, unhurried on the winding steps favoring the leg, and stood in the cramped loft among the ropes and the slow iron heart of the movement while she set the key to the barrel and wound, and the weights rose, and the going train took up its patient tread again. It stopped at 7 minutes past 4, she told him once, up there in the dusty light, her hand on the frame. The day he died, he stopped it himself, jammed the truth in behind the train with his own hands, and let the hands die at the hour, so that whoever came after would have to open it to make it go, and would find what he'd hidden. He trusted the clock to keep the truth better than any strongbox. And it did. She looked at the wheels turning. It runs past that hour now. Every afternoon it comes to 7 minutes past 4 and goes straight on through it, and I don't think there's a thing I've done in this house that pleases me more than that. He knew what he was about, Aldermore said, in the clock and in the choosing of you. He said it plainly, without weight, the way he said everything, and she took it plainly, and they went down the stair. He was not a man who hurried anything, and that suited her, who had been hurried all her life, hurried into her father's accounts as a girl, hurried into mourning, hurried north by a dying stranger's summons. There was no snatching in him. He would sit in the workshop while she worked and be content to be silent, and when he spoke it was to some purpose or to some real pleasure, never to fill the air. He was a widower these 9 years, he told her of it once, simply, without asking for sorrow, the way she had told him of her father. He did not speak of his rank at all, and when the county came to know that the Duke of Aldermore was calling of an afternoon upon the parson's daughter who kept the almshouse, and some tongues wagged that she had done well for herself, she paid them no more mind than she paid a clock that ran fast. She knew the difference between the man and the coronet, and it was the man who came up the beech row. He asked her in the summer, on the bench in the workshop with the door open to the warm and the 4 clocks on the wall keeping there several times, and he asked her the way he did all things, plainly and without flourish. "I am 44, he said, and lame, and quieter than most women would care for, and I have a great cold house up the valley that has wanted a mistress these 9 years and never found one I could ask. I have watched you keep this place. I have watched you keep faith with a man you never met, and with 4 old women the world had done with, and with your mother, whom you found here after she was gone. I do not think I have ever seen a thing kept so well as you keep what is given you. I should like to be given to you, Eleanor, if you will have me, not for what I am, for you have never once seemed to notice that, and I thank God for it, but for the reason any honest man asks any honest woman, because I cannot do without the steadiness of you. Eleanor set down the wheel she was holding. She was not a woman given to swooning, and she did not swoon now, but her ink-stained forefinger was not quite steady on the cloth, and she let it not be, and did not hide it. I will not pretend I have not thought of it, she said in her low, even voice. I have thought of it a good while. Not of the house up the valley, Mr. Hale, James, for I have a house and a charge, and I'll not give up the one nor the other for any coronet in England. If I come to you, I come as the warden of Fenwick's Rest, and mean to stay it. The clock is mine to wind. The women are mine to keep. My mother's bed is mine to make. I should think less of you if you said otherwise, he answered. I did not ask you to leave them. I asked to be let stand beside them. Then yes, she said, for the steadiness, which is the only thing worth marrying for that I have ever seen, and I have seen a good deal of what isn't. And she put out her ink-stained hand, and he took it in his broad one, and that was the whole of it. No more show than the winding of a clock, and as sure. They were married in the autumn in her father's old plain style, in the little church at Combe Marrow, with its cold stone and its smell of candle smoke that was so like the nave she had stood in a year before, with a black-edged letter in her glove. Mr. Treadwell came from Barnstaple, his half-moon spectacles fogging in the chill of the porch, and gave her away, which pleased them both more than either quite said. The 4 almswomen sat in the front pew in their best, Sarah Combe among them now, and Widow Hesketh in a new cap she had trimmed herself, sitting very straight and daring anyone to find her weeping, which she was. When the parson, the young man who had the living now, who had been kind to Eleanor from the first, pronounced them man and wife, it was 7 minutes past 4 in the afternoon by the turret clock above the Almshouse, and the clock struck the hour a little after, true and even, and went straight on past it into the evening as it did every day now, unstopped. So Eleanor Price became Duchess of Aldermore, and was called so in the county, and answered to it civilly enough, but the name she kept nearest was the older one, Warden of Fenwick's Rest, Keeper of the Trust, Mistress of a house of poor women that no forger's hand could ever touch again. For the founding deed was lodged now with Treadwell, and copied fair in the diocesan register, and read aloud once a year at Michaelmas, so that every soul in the parish should know the endowment was settled forever upon the poor women of Combe Marrow, and could no more be sold than the church tower. She kept Jonas's ledgers still, in her own upright hand, carrying the columns forward year on year. Rents received, coal laid in, physic, candles, and the 4, and then 5, and one winter 6, and she kept them to the farthing. Because a man who had recorded a farthing of tallow had chosen her to keep faith after him, and she did not mean to fail a dead stranger who had turned out to be no stranger at all. For that was the shape of it, in the end, that she came to see on the winding stair of an afternoon, with the key heavy in her pocket and her husband's slow step behind her. A stranger had left her a sealed house and a stopped clock, and it had looked, that first cold dusk on the moor, like the loneliest thing in the world, a bequest from a man she had never met, in a village she had never heard named, 40 miles from anyone who knew her face. And it had turned out to be the opposite of what it looked. It had turned out to be her mother's own doorstep. It had turned out to be a homecoming to a home she had never known she had, and a place that needed keeping, and a house full of women who came to be her own, and a good plain man walking up the beach row, and a clock that struck true. She wound it that afternoon as she wound it every third day, the weights rising under her hand and the going train taking up its patient tread. Below in the yard the light was long and gold across the gray stone, and somewhere one of the women was calling the cat in for its supper, and the beach row stirred. The clock came round to 7 minutes past 4, the hour a lonely, honest man had chosen to stop his own heart's timepiece and hide the truth where only an honest hand would find it, and it went on past, without a catch, into the ordinary evening. The hour of his death made it last into a beginning, and Eleanor stood a moment longer in the dusty gold light and listened to it go on, and was content.